What is up, everyone? JD here. I hope you're doing well today. I have a blade battle for you today. Let's get into it. So our blade battle today are going to have two fairly newly released contenders. First, we're going to have the newest EMPEDC relative as of the time of this video. That's going to be our first contender. Our next contender is going to be another knife that's relatively new from another very popular manufacturer, and that's going to be Quiet Carry, and this is the 9. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through ergos all the way up to blade performance, going basically end to end of the knife and determining winner category by category. So we'll go ahead and start with the Quiet Carry. The 9 here has a 4.22 inch titanium handle with my version having the micarta inlay, but you can also get it with carbon fiber, including fat carbon. It's really well done. Mine has a stone wash finish, but they do have the coated blade. But for this blade battle, we're just going to talk about what's in front of us to save a little bit of time. You have jimping out on the top on both sides. You have titanium back spacer, titanium milled deep carry pocket clip that lays flat. I call this the diving board. And then you have micro milling on the blade itself, on the handle itself, not the blade, which does add a little bit of grip due to that extra ribbing. And then the micarta, even though it is smooth, it does have like that tackiness to it, so you got plenty of grip there. For me, in the natural position, which is here, I have a little bit of the finger landing here and a little bit of the back middle finger landing on the back of that finger choil, and that gives me very comfortable grip. I do feel that there's a little bit missing here, but I have enough grip on that knife there to be able to hold it comfortably, and it does work really well with the power cut, because when I bring the thumb around, all of a sudden all of that jimping that's on the top there and that micro milling is making complete contact with all of my hand, and I have a lot of that micarta that's really gripped well in there, so it is very comfortable, very thin, even though this does have a little bit of that chamfering here. You do have rounded scales or contoured scales that do help make it feel a little bit fuller, and then you do have the height that also make it land really nicely in hand. I do feel the pocket clip, my hand kind of lands on either side of it, but because it's so well chamfered, it's not uncomfortable, so it's a very comfortable knife to hold. Now let's talk about ergos on the relative. The relative has a 4.4 inch titanium handle. This one here has micro milling all down the side, or milling, not micro milling, it has milling all down the side. It does have a sandblasted finish, it looks like. Nice diving board style pocket clip, really beefy too, and it goes in and out of the pocket nicely because it comes up, but it does catch a little bit on the micro milling on the back side. This one here is really well chamfered right in here, so when you go to hold this, this is super comfortable. I like that they added some thickness onto here. That was one of my complaints about the Nimble X, is that it was still a very skinny knife in hand. At that size, with it being kind of cut short here, or not as tall as scales, I like the chunkiness because it makes it very comfortable in hand. I can even move back and still get all 4 fingers onto this knife, so I think that for the reverse and for the pull cut, that's really important because you don't use that forward finger choil, so it's really comfortable to hold for those 2 less common positions. So very comfortable. Now, who would I give the win to? This one is really tough because even though the relative is chunkier, the 9 has the taller, more fuller scales that are chamfered, or contoured rather, so those are very comfortable. It's honestly, even sitting here for me, it's really hard to choose a winner. They're different style grips, but both are super comfortable. I'm gonna have to give it a tie. I really hate doing that. I always try my best to pick a winner for the category, but honestly, they're both really comfortable. They're just completely different. This one being chunkier, filling the handouts, it feels really nice, and so does the micro milling here, or the milling. I keep saying micro, I'm sorry. The milling here is really nice, but so is the texture in here. The jimping on the top is really nice and grippy, and then the micro milling really helps, and you get so much contact with the palm and the fingers on this scale. Even though it's skinnier, it kind of makes up the difference. So I am going to give that a tie. I'm really sorry, I hate to do that. I try my best not to. Now, neither one of these are reversible, so we're going to talk about the fact that that is a knock on both, so they both would be a tie far as usability. Now, the differences here, and the reason I'm doing this, are going to be the pocket clips. The pocket clip on the Relative does work well as far as going in and out of the pocket, but because of that milling and the contact patch, I do find from time to time as it gets towards the hem, or whatever you call that, the seam, the top of the pocket where the stitching is, where it's folded over with the liner and stitched together, it catches on that more so than the Quiet Carry does. The Quiet Carry goes in and out smoothly with no effort, but both pinch really well to where I don't worry about them coming out of the pocket. So I would give the pocket clip advantage to the Quiet Carry. Now, let's move on while we're still on the handles and talk about lock bar access. You do have knockdown. You have internal milling, so it's comfortable to come in whether you want to open it with your thumb laying flat on the scale, whether you want to come in from the side and let it fall to the finger, or you want to lift, start the close and let it fall closed. Really, really well done. The Quiet Carry has an extremely generous cutout, very nicely chamfered. Even though it's a little bit tighter to get in there, because of the way that they knocked it down and they chamfered it, you can get in really well for the side. You can get in okay for the finger laying flat. That contouring actually hampers that a little bit for me. And then for the pull up, it's really good, really, really good. So for the lock bar access, I would say that I would give it to the Relative because it's a little bit more generous and it's a little bit easier to get into all three methods. But I would say the access from the side would go to the Quiet Carry, and I would say the access for the pull-up, I don't know why I closed it first to show you that. For the pull-up, I would give to this because you can get more finger in there more comfortably. And then I would say for the lay flat, it would go towards the Relative. So I would say overall, the access is better on the Relative. Now, let's talk about deployment methods real quick. We'll start with the Quiet Carry. You have the thumb stud with a really good detent tune. It really fires out. Now, it was a little weak when I got mine, and I just lightly, when I went to install the skiffs, I just lightly kind of bounced the lock bar over a little bit, rocking it, and then put it back together to see how it feels, and that immediately made it very, very snappy. Feels good for thumb and reverse flick, and that is all that you get on the Quiet Carry. On the Relative, it came really well tuned. Best Tech did a fantastic job on this. Feels good for that flipper tab, for that reverse flick, and it is sharp enough here when you go in the hole to get that thumb deployment. So deployment methods, I would say go to the Relative. Far as the action, I would say the detent was better tuned from the factory. I would say after tuning up the Quiet Carry, I would give just a slight advantage to the Relative. While this just still feels snappy, I would say the detent tune here for the reverse flick and for the thumb flick, just comparing those two, feel a little bit snappier, feel a little bit stronger on the Relative. But if you don't like a strong detent, if you like a smooth detent, then the Quiet Carry. But for me, I'm giving that to the Relative. Now let's talk about action while we have the Quiet Carry here. The Quiet Carry has those newer bearings. I think it's 5mm 364. I think that's the smaller one, the thinner one, and it has 13 balls on it. So the factory bearings, I did check those because I wanted to get some feedback on those before I installed my skiffs. Both these have skiffs now, but I did test the factory bearings. I would say it feels a little bit smoother on the Quiet Carry. There's no feedback in the pivot. Very smooth opening, very smooth close. It's almost guillotine, and I think as it continues to break in, it may become guillotine. When I installed, just to FYI, the skiffs, I did end up having to put a little bit of thread locker. I couldn't quite get it to sit in that sweet spot with no blade play and smooth action, but it is super close to being guillotine. It just requires just the ever bit of shaking on that knife to close. Now, the Relative, same thing. Very smooth factory bearings. I did install the skiff. I think this one takes the traditional 5 364 balls, or whatever the ball count is. I'll throw it on the screen. I'm not remembering right now. But very smooth, no feedback. Feels very good with the detent. And this one here also is fall shut or shake shut, but it's not quite as fall shut as the quiet carry, and I think that has something to do with how the lock bar is tuned for the detent. I'd rather have the actual extra detent strength than it being a fall shut. But both are very smooth for all the deployment actions methods. I would give them a tie, even though I feel like the detent is stronger on the relative. So it does feel snappier on deployment, but on the close, the 9 feels smoother falling shut while still remaining fairly snappy. So I am giving it a tie because I think there's something, you know, close is smoother, feels snappier opening, right? So I feel like each has a little bit of an advantage, which is why I'm giving it a tie. But I still wanted to talk about where their strengths are depending on which you prefer. Do you prefer the snappier, stronger detent? Then the relative is going to be for you. The 9 is going to be more of that almost guillotine fall shut smoothness while still having a good detent to still feel satisfying on deploying it. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the blades. So both have CPM 20 CV blades. Both seem to have very respectable heat treats and are holding an edge really well so far. The quiet carry has a nice tall flat grind, and it is very thin behind the edge. You get a lot of blade here, so they're able to kind of carry that grind down to a nice thin edge that works really well. You got a nice clip point here that's good for detail work, draw cuts, pinch grip, things of that nature. It feels really good on the pinch grip. Now, the disadvantage being that the satin blade, you'll see here in a second, even though it has a good spot for the pinch grip, that satin finish, which looks really nice when it's all cleaned up, is going to show the fingerprints, but that doesn't really bother me too much. And then the finishes, I guess, let me clean it back off so you can see the finish on the blade. It has a really nice belt satin finish, very minimal hot spots to where the belt lines hit a little too hard on the grinds. I think it looks really, really, really good. Now let's move on over to the relative. You got a compound grind, you got a super thin hollow grind. This thing is surprisingly slicey for as thick of a blade stock as it starts with. It's not like the most thickest robust I've seen, right? It's a decent thickness that it starts life out at, but I mean, you can feel right here it drops immediately below that fuller and thumb hole, and it is thin all the way down to the blade. It's so thin. Feels really good going through the materials too, and you do have strength out on the tip for this clip point as well, so you have the nice angle here for your draw cuts and utility cuts. This one also feels really good in the pinch grip. Now, the more raw finish here is going to show less fingerprints on it, but it is very comfortable. I find that I'm able to easily put my middle finger into that finger choil to get out here, and then both clip points have a nice little spot here if you want to put the finger up, or if you need to move all the way up for that pinch grip. It's going to work really, really well. The finish on here is more of a raw finish, but I kind of like that. I like that for a couple of reasons. I like the grind lines. I think it's really cool looking, and it is very, very resistant to the fingerprints, as I showed you there a minute ago. So as far as the blades finishes, I think both have a very slicey edge, but I have to give the relative the advantage. The relative has that hollow grind, and it feels really, really slicey moving through the materials. But the quiet carry is no slouch. It goes through the materials really well because it does have a thinner blade stock to start out with, and it moves through really, really well. Now, the jimping, I would give the advantage to the relative. They carried it all the way out. I think all manufacturers should just do that. I think it doesn't look bad. It doesn't take away from the aesthetics, but you can put your thumb anywhere you want, whereas on the quiet carry, you're stuck way back here. This is where the jimping's at. So I definitely want to give the relative the advantage there. And then here, I feel like they did a nice job with the finishes here. It's not quite crowned, but it is chamfered on the edges, so it's not sharp. On the relative, you do feel a little bit of sharpness on the edges there, but it's so far out on the tip that I don't think it would matter. I prefer to have that jimping for me personally. Aesthetically, both are good looking knives. I'm giving them a tie for the looks. I just think both are very nice looking knives. I love the big belly, full handle on that 9, and I think that chamfering with that big old blade looks really good on the relative to me. So in the end, who's my winner? That is a tough choice. I think quite a few categories did go to the relative throughout, and I think because those slight advantages on the relative, I'd have to go to the relative. There's one more factor that I want to take into consideration, and that is price. The relative was coming in at $379, whereas the 9 is coming in at $330. So you get a little bit more bang for your buck. You'd have to decide, is that $49 price difference, is that enough to justify getting the relative over the quiet carry? I don't know. That is tough. While I think that there's some things on the relative that give it a slight advantage, I think I would have to recommend the 9. That $330 price point, getting 20 CV, nice flat ground blade, beautiful finishes, very comfortable ergos, and action that is really, really smooth is really compelling. But the relative does give you additional means of deployment. It is giving you a compound ground knife, so you're getting a really thin hollow grind, and you're getting strength on the tip with that flat grind. You're getting multiple means of deployment. With that fuller, it gives you the ability to reverse flick and thumb flick, which is something that is pretty important. So I can kind of understand the price jump on the relative because of the fact that there's a little bit extra going on with it, and you're getting big old milling lines on both sides of the scales. So who's my winner? I am going to have to go with the relative today. I think there's just a little bit more going on here that I appreciate with the knife. That forward finger choil is a more comfortable position. I'm able to get all of my fingers on that scale. Unlike the 9, if I want to do that, I run out of space on the back to get all of the fingers to touch. And then I do have like that empty space there, even though it is comfortable. That empty space there is a little weird for me in order to be able to get in that choked up position where I don't have to deal with that with the relative. I also really like this flat grind. I love to see, this hollow grind. I really do love to see that they offered that. I think it looks really good with the compound grind, and I can't wait to see what the drop point looks like. I hope the drop point is a complete hollow grind all the way out, but if they do decide to do a compound again to give you strength on the tip, that is going to be just fine by me. I really like the way that this has performed. It's really nice, and I think it's going to be an LMAX, so that's going to be cool. Now, I do want to point out one little thing that I didn't cover here, and I don't normally cover sharpening on here, but because this compound grind, you have that Japanese style tanto, you have this acute point here. That is something to take into consideration because this flat grind comes all the way back to this tip here. So it is deceptive. Your hollow grind is actually between these 2 points, but when you go to sharpen that, you're going to have to keep that in mind. For me, I'm probably just going to go ahead and go straight through and round it. I don't think this is thick enough to where I'm too worried about keeping that acute point, and I think it'll perform just fine. Your angle is going to be a little bit different because of the thickness here, but this tip here is just not enough for me to justify keeping it and using that tip. I would just round that out and use the clip point tip for all of my utility cuts. It's going to be much easier to sharpen that quiet carry, so that is just something to think about if you sharpen your own knives. If you're just maintaining it with a strop and honing it with a ceramic rod on occasion, which is what I do try to do with the knife when it comes with a really good factory edge. I mean, in my Spydercos, I don't go out and immediately try to sharpen those. And both these have really good edges, so I probably would just continue to strop and hone as I go until it's time that it really needs to be sharpened. But the relative is my winner today. Let me know in the comments below, who would you have picked? And would the combination of colors made a factor for you? Because they have a beautiful black white blade, which I think has the gold titanium hardware accenting it, which looks really, really nice. And then you have the Nebula Fat Carbon. You have the blacked out version with both, I believe. I could be wrong on that. It might just be a black blade, and a raw finish on the blade for the relative. But for me today, I had to go with the relative, but I love both these knives. Hard to argue with either one of these. Really nice, very well done. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks and shout out to everyone out there that likes, comments, and is subscribed. I appreciate all the support and the love. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I hope you have a fantastic week. Until next time, peace.